Thank you for joining us for this month's digital presentation of the CCHM Speaker Series. The Brautigan Library, a very public library, turns 30. I'm April Busby, Outreach and Programs Manager here at the Clark County Historical Museum. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors. First, we'd like to thank Wager Audio for all their help this year with streaming our programs like the Speaker Series. If you need help with digital streams, virtual events, or production services, take a moment to check them out. They do incredible work and have been a pleasure to work with. We also want to thank the Clark County Historic Preservation Commission. Their support year in and year out has been vital for keeping our speaker series going. And it is because of this support that we are able to bring you this and all of our digital speaker series presentations free of charge while we all do our part to fight COVID. We have many things happening at the museum over the next few months. If you haven't had a chance to take one of our historic property research workshops yet, registration is now opening for our fall session, which starts September 11th. On September 24th, we and other nonprofits throughout Clark County will be participating in Give More 24. This year, help CCHM amplify our shared stories by joining us for our annual History-a-thon from 7 a.m. to midnight and donating to support our mission to gather, save, and share Clark County's history. We are also excited to announce that CCHM will be reopening on a limited basis beginning with the Members and Donors Only Week, September 24th through the 26th. We'll be opening to the public starting around October 1st, so check out our website for more details. In addition, we'll be back October 1st with our speaker series for a look at the history of housing and race in Clark County. We'll also be presenting our final History on Tap for 2020 as everyone's favorite spooky storytellers, Brad Richardson, Jeff Davis, and Pat Gelata return to present Campfire Tales 2, The Haunted History of Clark County, on October 15th. Tickets will be on sale shortly. Finally, we'll be bringing back a special month of walking tours in October. Watch our Facebook page and website for those dates. And don't forget to contribute to our special collection, Capture the Moment. Help us gather and save the story of Clark County during this unprecedented time by donating images, writings, videos, and other pieces that reflect the day-to-day happenings during the COVID pandemic. And if you know of a small business or organization with historic roots or a story to tell, let us know and they may be featured in our series, History at a Distance. And now to this month's presentation. 10 years ago, CCHM was pleased to welcome the Brautigan Library to the museum. Since then, we've worked closely with Dr. John Barber at Washington State University, Vancouver, to ensure that this unique piece of Pacific Northwest history continues to be a beacon to inspiring writers for generations to come. We are excited to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Brautigan Library by welcoming Dr. Barber to present on the library and the man who inspired it. During this month's presentation, we will be collecting donations to help support the digitization and archiving of the Brautigan Library. We hope you'll be able to contribute to support this project, and the link can be found in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Barber, for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for joining this virtual talk from the Clark County Historical Museum in downtown Vancouver, Washington, USA. As you can see from my background, I am not actually in the museum. Probably, like you, I am sheltering in my home, hoping to avoid the coronavirus, which seems to be everywhere out there in the world. In an effort to keep us all safe and in good health, Bradley Richardson, director of the Clark County Historical Museum, has asked that I record my scheduled talk so that it might be streamed over the internet to anyone who is interested. I am pleased that you are interested, and I appreciate your time and effort to join this virtual talk. The subject of the talk is the Brautigan Library, a permanent exhibition at the Clark County Historical Museum. As I will tell you, the Brautigan Library was first established in Burlington, Vermont in the 1990s. I was able to negotiate its move to Vancouver in 2010. I will also talk about what constitutes the Brautigan Library, why it is not only interesting, but also important. And I will talk about the man who came up with the idea for the Brautigan Library. That man is Washington native Richard Brautigan, an American author of novels, short stories, poetry, and more, who rose to international fame in the late 1960s and early 1970s as the author to best capture the zeitgeist of the counterculture movement in San Francisco during that decade. I will rejoin you after the talk for some concluding remarks and to introduce some brief words by 3 individuals closely associated with the Brautigan Library. So once again, thank you for joining us. Now please, sit back and enjoy the talk. Hello, I'm John Barber, a faculty member with the Creative Media and Digital Culture program at Washington State University, Vancouver. The topic of my talk is Washington-born author Richard Brautigan and his inspiration behind the Brautigan Library collection at the Clark County Historical Museum. The Brautigan Library collects, archives, and shares nearly 300 manuscripts written by, in most cases, unknown and unpublished writers from 31 states, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, India, and Saudi Arabia between 1990 and 1995. The collection also includes business papers and other artifacts that document a very interesting experiment to provide a public shelf free of restrictions on content or quality of writing for writers keen to share their narratives. It's an unusual concept, one meant to promote everyone's voice being heard, and it is exciting that we all get to play a part in the story as it unfolds here in Vancouver. The story behind this unique library is also very interesting and begins with a man from whom the library takes its name. Richard Brautigan is an American writer of short stories, poetry, and novels, the author most often cited as the best to capture the zeitgeist of the San Francisco counterculture during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, that may not seem like so much of a big deal, but there is more to this story, and it is interesting and inspiring. First, Brautigan is a native son. Born 30 January 1935 in Tacoma, Washington, Richard Gary Brautigan grew up in the poverty of the Pacific Northwest during the Depression and World War II, aspiring to be a writer while attending high school in Eugene, Oregon. He had, in fact, some publication success while in high school and in the years immediately following his graduation. I'll talk more about this in just a moment. In Brautigan's day, the center of everything happening on the West Coast was in San Francisco, and he moved there in 1956, where he set about pursuing his dream of being a writer. San Francisco in the late 1950s provided a spectrum of evolving art and literature that ranged from the beat movement through the so-called San Francisco Renaissance to the counterculture and beyond. Brautigan was there, and although he always maintained he was not a member of any movement, his work shows clearly how he was influenced by what he saw and experienced. Followers of the beat movement gathered in the coffee shops, art galleries, bars, and salons in the San Francisco's North Beach district to listen to bebop jazz, talk politics, and read their poetry. Brautigan was well connected with this part of the San Francisco literary scene. In this 1957 painting, Witch Poet, by Carolyn Lynn Geary, Brautigan is participating in the Blabbermouth Night readings at the Place, 546 Grant Avenue, a popular gathering spot for artists and writers. Although Brautigan always maintained he was not a beat, he was good friends with many of them and often was featured at their poetry readings and was included in the historic photograph The Last Gathering of the Beats by Larry Keenan, taken in 1965 in front of the justly famous City Lights books. Brautigan is shown in the white hat, just right of the center in this version of the photograph, cropped here to a vertical format from the original horizontal image. As a result, only half of the beats gathered are shown in this version of the photograph. San Francisco poet Jack Spicer founded an anti-beat literary movement based on the traditions of Greek and Roman mythology and poetry rather than spontaneity and Eastern philosophies espoused by the beat generation. Spicer helped Brautigan with the line-by-line editing of his first novel, Trout Fishing in America, and arranged some of Brautigan's earliest readings from that novel just prior to its publication in 1967. I'll say more about this novel in just a moment. Both the Beats and Spicer were superseded by the counterculture movement evolving in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Members of this movement, generally young, middle-class individuals, set about establishing a collective, communal, and counterculture community. They called themselves hippies, a term originally used pejoratively by black jazz musicians to denote, quote, junior grade hipsters, referring to the white Beats co-opting black jazz music. The freedoms hippies espoused were often criticized as outspoken resistance to mainstream traditional American values, roles, and expectations, and provide a center for any current-day discussion of the 60s. Throughout this incredible mix of influences, Brautigan remained true to his dream of becoming a writer. He practiced his craft first through poetry, which he printed as broadsides at the Communication Company, and then gave away freely on the streets of San Francisco. He said that he used poetry to learn to write sentences. When he felt he could write a decent sentence, Brautigan turned his attention to writing novels. After more than a decade of dashed hopes, Brautigan catapulted to overnight international fame with the publication of his novel Trout Fishing in America in 1967. Trout Fishing in America was not Brautigan's first published novel. That honor goes to a Confederate general from Big Sur, published 3 years earlier by Grove Press as a part of a 3-book publishing contract. Sales, however, were disappointing, and Brautigan's contract was canceled. A Confederate general from Big Sur was based on Brautigan's friendship and escapades, real and imagined, with Price Dunn. With the success of Trout Fishing in America, a Confederate general was republished and received a much better welcome. A Confederate general from Big Sur is sometimes cited as Brautigan's first book publication, but more correctly, that honor is bestowed on The Return of the Rivers, published in May 1957, because of the fact that it was published in wrappers or covers. In fact, the wrappers were sheets of construction paper, folded to enclose a single poem, which was printed on a separate sheet. The title label, signed by Brautigan, was attached to the front cover. All 100 copies of this limited edition were hand-assembled by Brautigan and his wife, Virginia Alder. Hang on to this thought about self-publishing, as it becomes an important component of the Brautigan Library, as we will see shortly. The poem The Return of the Rivers is often cited as Brautigan's earliest publication, but, as we can see here, there are several earlier publications. These 3 poems appeared in the newspapers and literary magazines of 1955 and 1956. These poems appeared in supplements included with the Portland Oregonian from 1953 to 1955. These 2 poems were published regionally, both in 1953. And this poem, The Light, appeared in Brautigan's high school newspaper, the Eugene High School News, in December 1952. Published on page 5 under the heading Poet's Nook, this is, as far as I have been able to determine, the first Brautigan publication, and the first to use the Brautigan surname. But that's a topic for a future talk. Following success with Trout Fishing in America, Brautigan published a number of other novels, collections of poetry, a collection of short stories, and an album of spoken voice recordings. In each, Brautigan is noted for his detached, anonymous, first-person point of view, his idiosyncratic, autobiographical, quirky yet easy-to-read prose style and episodic narrative structure full of unconventional but vivid images powered by imagination, strange and detailed observational metaphors, humor, satire, all presented in a seemingly simplistic, childlike manner. Beyond his unique writing style, there was Brautigan's penchant for putting photographs of mysterious women on the covers of his early books. There is an interesting story associated with each, but again, that is the subject of future talks. Speaking of Brautigan's use of vivid and imaginative images, here is one of my personal favorites as an example. This is the story The Scarlatti Tilt, in its entirety. 2 sentences, 34 words. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. What more do you need? Anything else is just additional detail. In these 2 sentences, Brautigan has captured the very bones of a compelling story. The late 1960s and early 1970s were Brautigan's heyday, and his best-known works, Trout Fishing in America, a novel published in 1967, The Pill versus the Spring Hill Mine Disaster, a collection of poetry published in 1968, and Revenge of the Lawn, a collection of stories published in 1971, earned him accolades, as I have said, as the one author to best capture the zeitgeist, the sense of citizenship and belonging of the counterculture in San Francisco. Brautigan refused to write, in his words, the son of trout fishing in America. His later books abandoned the photographic cover concept and courageously experimented with odd combinations of established literary genres. For example, The Hawkline Monster is subtitled A Gothic Western. Sombrero Fallout is a Japanese novel, and Willard and His Bowling Trophies is a perverse mystery. Critics met these books with diminished enthusiasm, put off by Brautigan's apparent preoccupation with sadness and death, and his refusal to write further in his earlier, more humorous vein. Readers fell away as well, and this downward trend continued throughout the remainder of Brautigan's career. He often said he did not care about the critics, but losing his readers was something that truly broke Brautigan's heart. Even while his American audience turned its back, an international audience embraced Brautigan and his writing, especially in Japan. He traveled there often, staying at Tokyo's Kyo Plaza Hotel. His experiences in Japan inspired a collection of 77 poems entitled June 30th, June 30th, published in 1978, and at least half of the short chapters in his novel The Tokyo Montana Express, published in 1980. The 1970s and the 1980s were not as kind to Brautigan, and at the time of his death he was largely ignored, or worse, negated by American critics and readers who trivialized his work, criticized his lack of political focus, and called him naive. Naive or not, Brautigan's bibliography is extensive and includes 11 published novels, 10 poetry collections, 1 story collection, 4 volumes of collected work, several nonfiction essays, and a record album of spoken voice recordings. Brautigan's final novel, An Unfortunate Woman, was published posthumously. Generally speaking, an author's reception continues after death as it was in life, either up or down. Despite his negative reception by literary critics and the press, Brautigan continues daily to attract new readers who claim him as their favorite writer. This is especially true internationally, where his works are translated into nearly 30 languages. Today, Richard Brautigan is often cited as a beat, hippie, or 60s cult writer because of the popularity of his writing during the counterculture movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s. More kindly, as I have said, he is noted as the one author to best capture the zeitgeist of this period of profound cultural, social, and political change. Such labels are crippling and unfair, especially since, I believe, Brautigan is more appropriately seen as a voice for the time in which we encounter his works. One label that Brautigan did apply to himself was that of an observer, and his opinion of life and death inhabits much of his work, giving it a personal, autobiographical quality that provides a point of access for many of his readers. It is easy, and also unfair, to categorize Brautigan as a left-field beatnik, tapped as the poster child for a hippie scene when he came to prominence in the late 1960s underground marketplace, where publishing houses were trying to get hip with a youth counterculture sprouting literary pretensions. This approach, however, explains neither Brautigan's continued popularity nor his continuing inspiration for the creative endeavors of others. Brautigan's use of humor, emotion, and imagination continue to work their magic as scholars and researchers find his work central to any study of the 60s, and writers, readers, artists, musicians, and others find inspiration and insight in the works of Richard Brautigan. Extrapolating from these points, it's more useful to consider Brautigan not as a representative of a particular literary genre or era, but rather as a pioneer, leading a transition toward, as some critics and writers argue, a unique form of the postmodern novel that constructs a world seen through his unique vision, propelled by his message of hope and imagination, and offering a sense of citizenship and belonging to everyone who visits. Such success has prompted admiring authors like James Kinsella to apply the label Brautigans to the style of writing pioneered by Richard Brautigan. Others predict that soon we will all write such Brautigans, and I think there is a good deal to recommend this idea, especially when you think of how Brautigan's writings anticipated blogging and social networking. But again, that's a topic for a future talk. Talking of writing and Brautigan's use of writing to promote citizenship and belonging brings us back to the subject of tonight's talk, the Brautigan Library. In his novel The Abortion, an historical romance published in 1971, Brautigan envisioned a library where anyone could deposit a copy of their self-authored book, regardless of content or quality of writing. In essence, he described a library for writers, a place where anyone, everyone, could have a voice. These books were permanently archived in the library, although no one could come to the library to read them. As physical storage space in the library ran short, excess books were transported to a hermetically sealed cave in Northern California. Everyone was, apparently, satisfied that these unpublished books had a home. When accepting manuscripts into the library, the librarian, the narrator of the novel, would enter the title and brief descriptions in the librarian's journal. Example titles and descriptions include Leather Clothes and the History of Man by S.M. Justice. His book was made entirely of leather, the librarian writes. The Stereo and God by the Reverend Lincoln Lincoln. The librarian said of this book, the author said that God was keeping his eye on stereophonic phonographs. A History of Nebraska by Clinton York. The librarian notes that the author said he had never been to Nebraska, but had always been interested in the state. And finally, there's The Culinary Dostoevsky by James Fallon, about which the librarian writes, a cookbook of recipes he found in Dostoevsky's novel. Brautigan's imaginary library is modeled precisely after the Presidio branch of the San Francisco Public Library System, right down to the zip code. Built with funds donated by Andrew Carnegie, the Italian Renaissance-style Presidio branch library opened in 1921. The interior, according to Brautigan's description, featured high arched windows above the bookshelves. Trees outside the windows spread their branches like paste against the glass. In 1990, inspired by Brautigan's statement, there just simply had to be a library like this, Todd Lockwood, a Brautigan fan, founded the Brautigan Library in Burlington, Vermont. Remaining true to Brautigan's original vision, the Brautigan Library accepted submissions from aspiring writers regardless of subject or quality of writing. The only requirement was that the work had to be unpublished at the time it was received by the library. But deviating from the original vision, the Brautigan Library encouraged folks to visit the library, handle, and read the books. In order to facilitate interaction with the books, the Brautigan Library employed the mayonnaise system, the first book classification system since the Dewey Decimal Classification, developed in 1876 by Melville Dewey to classify books according to the month and order of their receipt, as well as their placement within one of 13 categories. These categories were family, natural world, spirituality, love, humor, future, adventure, street life, war and peace, social, political, culture, meaning of life, poetry, and my favorite, all the rest. The mayonnaise system borrowed its name from the mayonnaise chapter, the last chapter of Brautigan's novel Trout Fishing in America, where the anonymous narrator states, expressing a human need, I always wanted to write a book that ended with the word mayonnaise. In 1995, increased operating costs forced the Brautigan Library to become an exhibit within the context of the Fletcher Free Library, also in Burlington, Vermont. No new manuscripts were added to the collection during this time. In 2006, the entire contents of the Brautigan Library collection were placed into storage, not in hermetically sealed caves, but rather in Lockwood's basement. Now, after years of negotiation, the Brautigan Library has a new home here in Vancouver, Washington, as a permanent collection within the Clark County Historical Museum. Like the Presidio branch, the Clark County Historical Museum is a former Carnegie Library. Built in 1909, this brick building was Vancouver's original public library. The steps leading up to the front door, the high arched windows, the trees, and now the books are all interesting connections to and reminders of Brautigan's original vision for his unique library. The mission of this museum is to collect, preserve, and interpret culture and history of the Pacific Northwest. Richard Brautigan, born and raised here in Washington, and as an internationally recognized and celebrated author, is worthy of our time and attention, especially his vision for a very public library where readers and writers of all levels and abilities can find a welcoming place to connect and share their stories. The Brautigan Library collection then becomes, for the Clark County Historical Museum, a nexus for promoting critical thinking in our community. As you can imagine, there are a number of challenges in this regard. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I will, of course, be interested to answer your questions and address your comments. Hello once again, this time in person and not the recorded voice you just heard delivering the talk. Thank you so much for your patience with this unusual mode of delivery, but it is what we can do to connect in these challenging circumstances. Now, I would like to introduce Richard Holton, author of Lumber World, an unpublished manuscript he submitted to the Brautigan Library. Mr. Holton is speaking from his home in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he is surrounded by wildfires. You can imagine his concern for his safety and that of his belongings, and so will appreciate his efforts to make his manuscript available through the Brautigan Library. Here is Mr. Holton.
Hi, my name is Richard Holton. I'm a mostly fiction writer, and my virtual Zoom background, like so many of the talking head experts we see on the media now in time of pandemic, just happens to be composed of some of my publications. But I'm recording this at a time not only during the pandemic, but also as some of the largest wildfires in California history surround where I live in the Bay Area. And as my wife and I restock our go bags with essential emergency supplies for possible evacuations, I realized that my prized print publications, and now I have a note to switch off my virtual background. There we go. My prized print publications and all my first editions and other books could go up in smoke. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally with the pandemic, over the past year or so, I have redone my will to account for my small literary estate and all of what we now call our digital assets. I've donated my father's papers to a library and museum, and some of my mother's papers and memorabilia to her hometown historical society. I also double checked on our fire insurance and photographed everything in the house and uploaded it to Google Photos. And one of the best things I did, not only in terms of being able to sleep well at night, but also in terms of preserving my small literary legacy, was to digitize and submit this. I'll show you my 1984 unpublished novel. That was the only existing copy, which was in paper. Lumber World, it's called, to the Brautigan Digital Library. Now, it was sheer genius of John Barber when he took over as librarian of the Brautigan Library to create the Brautigan Digital Library, and thus turn what was formerly a real-world instantiation of a fictional library for unpublished literary works into a virtual library of unpublished works that is also itself a form of publication. Because in the Brautigan Digital Library, my unpublished novel is A, preserved for posterity and my grandkids, and B, available as a PDF for anyone in the world to read. Are you listening, Hollywood screenwriters? Lumber World could make a great movie. At the same time, I still maintain the copyright, and so I can seek other forms of publication as I wish. Already, the talented voice performer Phoenix Crockett has selected Lumber World for audio recording, and the Brautigan Library has begun posting his podcasts of the novel, much like books on tape or Audible. My self-referential twist on depositing a work in the Brautigan Library was, with the encouragement of John Barber, to include with my unpublished manuscript all the rejection letters it received over several years from editors and agents, thus publishing the complete record of the manuscript's journey to not be published, and also situating Lumber World and this in a long-standing literary tradition of not only being rejected multiple times, but also sharing those rejections. In short, to me and to many other writers, and to all its readers and fans, the Brautigan Library and its Brautigan Digital Library are a rare and invaluable arts and cultural resource. It's a unique literary treasure. There's absolutely nothing like it. And everyone who cares about the arts and the literary arts should be grateful to the Clark County Historical Museum for hosting the Brautigan Library, and to its librarian and also creator of the Brautigan Digital Library, John Barber.
Next, we will hear from Len Kirshner, who lives in nearby Portland, Oregon. He is also a writer, one who channels both Ernest Hemingway and Richard Brautigan. Mr. Kirshner has contributed several stories from a trilogy of novels he is writing to the Brautigan Library, and in his telling, I think you will see that he has created yet another interesting short story. Here is Mr. Kirshner.
Okay, this is my second attempt. I'll try to make it shorter. I learned about the Brautigan Library. I knew about Andrew starting it, and I knew that it had something happen in Vermont, and I went to Montana in 2019 went around looking at the places where I associated Brautigan to. I got the Jubilee Hitchhiker, and I came back home and I realized I had driven by Brautigan's old ranch house at least 4 times, going to the Pine Creek Lodge in Pine Creek, Montana. I went to Elk Creek Books in Livingston. I found the remaining books of Brautigan's that I didn't have. And so then I came home, I Googled Brautigan, found that book, 800 pages, and learned that a lot of what he wrote about that seemed weird actually happened. For example, in So the Wind Won't Blow It All Away, the people bringing their living room furniture to the beach of, I guess it was a pond, and sitting there all day, then bringing it all back home. That actually happened. He actually saw that, which is really shocking to me. And so I had an idea about black flies from when I was on a walk on Lake Huron in Michigan, where when I told my friend, this place must be packed in the summertime. I don't know why, when I lived in Dearborn, Michigan, that I never went there. And she said, black flies, the whole place will be clear. Nobody goes up here because of the black flies. I thought that was a good mascot for a high school. Had that idea in my head, the black flies. So I developed the Snot Lake High School. I had a great niece who was going to Texas, and she went to see her mother in Owasso, Michigan, and her vehicle broke down, so she was there for almost a year trying to get out of there. So I came up with the idea of Almost Like Texas for the first book of the first short story of my trilogy, called Snot Lake, which is Almost Like Texas, Ernest Hemingway on the Shiawassee, and the last one is called Snot Lake. And I've written, the last one is titled By Default, about a character from a book that I'm writing that comes to my door and tells me that she doesn't want to be in the book because of the way that I treat women. I'm pretty happy with that. That totally takes place within my house, which is a good quarantine type of a story during a pandemic. All right, so the last video was too long to send. So what attracted you? When I moved to Oregon in the summer of 1974, I had a friend who said, "You're broke, so here, we read these." And he gave me the Confederate Journal, Trout Fishing, Revenge of the Lawn, and Watermelon Sugar. And I read all of those sitting on a lawn in Eugene, Oregon. I related to Brautigan because it was the first reading that I ever did that was really fun. It was fun to read those books. And I kind of related to how he thought, like looking for the absurd things in life. Anyway, the next story I'm thinking of is called Crack Canyon, and it could be Western, it could be soft porn, but I don't really want to go there. Yeah, so because the other video was too long, I think if I just end it right here, and I will do everything I can to keep sending stuff in. I'll talk with you later. This is Len Kirshner, L-E-N, not Glenn, Len, Kirschner.
Finally, I am pleased to introduce Phoenix Crockett, the audio archivist for the Brautigan Library. Mr. Crockett lives in Burlington, Vermont, and contacted me one day to say that he would like to record himself reading manuscripts in the Brautigan Library's collection and turn them into podcasts, which would be available for the listening pleasure of anyone in the world. He has read and recorded several short stories by Lynn Kirshner and both volumes of Mr. Holton's Lumber World. That last one was quite an undertaking, as the manuscript runs to nearly 900 pages. Here is Mr. Crockett.
Hello everyone, my name is Phoenix Crockett, and though I have no formal title, I am the audio archivist of the Brautigan Library. I discovered the library 2 years ago when I was studying Richard Brautigan's work for a pet project and first read The Abortion, an Historical Romance. I was enamored with the idea and figured someone must have put one of these together already. A quick Google search revealed that John has been running the library for a while now, and I connected with him immediately to ask about how I could get involved. We decided that I would use my humble equipment and humbler skills to record and edit audio submissions to the library in audio format, then release the submissions in the library website, as well as on podcast platforms under the name The Brautigan Library Podcast. The Brautigan Library is fun, but it's not just about fun. It's about documenting art that rarely gets documented. So much of our fictional, historical, scientific, and poetic literature exists only because it was produced or accepted by the highest classes of society, with the strictest rules about content and form, and with great barriers related to money or bureaucratic steps. By preserving the literary work of those not strictly situated in the literary world, there exists a more authentic version of literature, perhaps. I am not sure if this is what RB intended, but the cause is a wonderful one regardless. Now, the library relies on donations to exceed, so that I'm hopeful that those watching will consider making a tax-deductible donation. Funds are needed to digitize manuscripts, upgrade the website, as well as make it more accessible, and administrating in conjunction with the Clark County Historical Museum. Thanks y'all for watching this talk, and if you'd like to volunteer your time to read manuscripts in an audio format under my close direction, please email me at firstname.lastname@uvm.edu. That's PHOENIX.CROCKETT@uvm.edu. Thank you.
I'm back one last time to say thank you for joining us and ask for you to help us as we try to move the Brautigan Library forward. We're getting great press and have been interviewed by French Radio International and been featured in an episode of This American Life called The Room of Requirement. What we don't have a lot of is financial report. The Clark County Historical Museum is supported primarily by its members and donors. I encourage you to become either or both and do what you can to help the Brautigan Library. Every donation is tax deductible and goes toward our efforts to digitize more manuscripts, making them easier to share with you at home. We also want to build a searchable database that will make finding interesting manuscripts easier and more rewarding. And we want to continue offering National Unpublished Writers' Day, the last Sunday of every January, to celebrate Richard Brautigan's birthday and the Brautigan Library. Part of what we do on National Unpublished Writers' Day is host reading and writing events in the Historical Museum. Your contribution will go a long way to helping us continue this important community literacy outreach. Thank you again for joining us for this talk. This is John Barber, and it has been my pleasure to host and deliver this talk. Watch the Clark County Historical Museum website for information about upcoming events and future talks. Until we can meet again in person, please go well, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and stay healthy. Goodbye.